be back together this evening. Another opportunity to spend some time in praise and worship to our awesome God. I hope that today's been encouraging to you. God's given us a beautiful day to be together and a beautiful day to spend time thinking about Him and thinking about His Word. I hope that today's been encouraging to you. As we talked about this morning, we're not of the world. We've been chosen out of the world. Every day we live in the world, but we're not of it. So as we go out this week into the world and go to work, or school's not going on right now. How about that? But as we go about doing different things throughout the week, I hope that what we've done right here will encourage us to live for Jesus. If you have your Bibles, let's go to Philippians, the 4th chapter. Philippians chapter 4. If you'd like to follow along with me, we're going to be, as we continue to work our way throughout this letter, studying the book of Philippians together. Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. As you can see up on the screen, the title for our lesson tonight is Being Content in Every Circumstance. That's a pretty hard thing to do, isn't it? It's pretty challenging. It's pretty difficult. Finding complete joy, complete satisfaction, complete sufficiency with life in the present is not an easy thing to do. I don't know if any of you ever watched the show The Goldbergs. I'm not talking about the new one that's on TV right now, but the one that was back like in the 50s or 60s. Personally, I've never watched it, so I'm not recommending it to you. I'm not recommending it to you. But I was reading about an episode of this show that came on TV where Jake, who is the husband of the family, came home after work really excited about this new business idea that he had. And so he was just talking the ear of his wife off, whose name was Molly, about this new business idea and all the money that they were going to make. They sat down at the table and were eating supper, and he just kept going on and on and on. We're going to make so much money with this, Molly. One day, we're not going to be eating off of these plates anymore. We're going to be eating off of plates made out of gold. Isn't that going to be awesome? Molly looked up from her plate and said, Jake, do you think that that's going to make the food taste any better? Being content in every circumstance is a hard thing to do. Let me give you another illustration. I actually said this last week. Whenever summertime comes and it gets really hot outside, like it is right now, what do we oftentimes say? Boy, I wish it was cooler outside. I'm just about tired of this hot weather. I'm ready for winter to come. I'm ready for fall. I'm ready for the winter season. But then whenever the winter season comes and it starts to get really cold, what do we say? Whew, I just can't wait till summer. I can't wait till it's hot and I can sit out by the pool and I can be outside without having to put on like 5 layers. Being content in every circumstance is a hard thing to do. Finding complete joy and satisfaction and sufficiency with life in the present is challenging because we're always looking for more in the future. Sometimes we allow our desire for more things or better things in the future to rob us of our contentment with life in the present. It's like another story I heard about a really rich industrialist who saw a fisherman. He had pulled his boat up on the shore. He was sitting with his back against his boat, just looking out over the sea. The rich industrialist walked over to him and said, "What are you doing? Aren't you supposed to be fishing right now?" The fisherman said, "I caught all the fish I wanted for today. I have all that I need." "What do you mean you have all that you need? Why don't you go out there and get more fish than what you need?" The fisherman asked, "Well, what would I do with that?" You could tell the rich man was starting to get impatient. "What do you mean, what would you do with that? When you get more fish, you'll get more money. And when you get more money, you can get bigger boats so that you can go out deeper into the sea. And when you go out deeper into the sea, you're going to get more fish and you're going to get bigger fish. And then when you get those bigger fish, you're going to get more money. And when you get more money, you can go buy some nylon nets and you're not just going to be using the fishing rod to fish every day, but you'll have these really nice nets where you can get more fish. Don't you get it? If you get more fish than what you need, you'll get more money. And if you get lucky, you might be rich like me one day." The fisherman said, "Then what would I do?" Well, The rich man said, you can sit back and enjoy life. When you get all that money and you have all these boats and you have all these nice things, you can just sit back and enjoy it. The fisherman looked up at the rich man and asked, what do you think I'm doing right now? As he sat with his back against the boat, looking out over the sea, what do you think I'm doing in this moment? Don't get me wrong here. There's nothing wrong with having a desire for more. There's nothing wrong with having a desire to better yourself or to better your family. The problem comes in when we allow that desire for more to rob us of our contentment. When we allow that desire for more things or better things in the future to rob us of our satisfaction with life in the present. The problem comes when our sufficiency and our contentment becomes based on either the people in our lives or the circumstances of our lives. When we look at the message of Philippians 4, verses 10 through 13, it goes back to this idea: as Christians, we should be content in every circumstance. And so tonight, we're not really going to structure it very tightly. I just want us to walk through these few verses together in Philippians 4 and see what Paul has to say about this message. Let's begin with verse 10. Philippians 4 and verse 10. Paul says, remember, we're wrapping up this letter. The last few times we've studied, we're talking about standing firm in the Lord. And so now he switches gears just a little bit. He says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. One of the main ideas that we've been talking about as we've studied in the book of Philippians together is why Paul wrote this letter in the first place. One of the main reasons, one of the main purposes that Paul wrote this letter to the church of Philippi, more specifically in verse 2, to the elders and deacons of the congregation, is because he wants to say thank you. He wants to express his gratitude for their financial support and the relationship, the friendship that they share in Jesus. We saw that all the way back in Philippians chapter 1. Remember verse 3? He says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy. Well, Paul, why do you pray for them so often? Why are you so thankful for them? Because, verse 5, of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Paul's expressing his gratitude, expressing his thanksgiving for not just their financial support, but their relationship and their friendship. If you go to the end of the book in Philippians 4 and verse 18, Paul says, I've received full payment and more. I'm well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus. Go back to Philippians chapter 2. Paul talks a little bit about Epaphroditus. We talked about that a little bit ago. He says, I've received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. So he's saying thank you. Expressing his gratitude. This is the way he says it in verse 10. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly. When you look at the book of Philippians, does that phrase, rejoice in the Lord, look familiar? It's actually something that Paul had told the Philippians to do on two separate occasions. In Philippians 3 and verse 1, he tells them, finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. And then Philippians 4 and verse 4, we thought about this a little bit ago. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. It's something that Paul told the Philippians to do, but it's something that he himself also did. It's not just something he commanded, but it's something that he practiced. Paul is rejoicing in the Lord. In fact, he's rejoicing in the Lord greatly. Why? Why is Paul greatly rejoicing in the Lord? Here's what he says. That now at length you have revived your concern for me. We've talked about how the Philippians were constantly supporting the Apostle Paul and sending him gifts. Paul's thankful that they were able to start that again. That they were able to revive that. For some reason, the Philippians had to halt their support for Paul for just a little bit. For just a season. For some reasons outside of their control, they had to stop supporting Paul. Paul says, I know it's not because you didn't care. He says, it's not because you had a lack of concern for me or for my ministry. He says in verse 10, it's because you lacked opportunity. Maybe the church of Philippi lost contact with Paul when he was arrested and put under house arrest, so they had to send Epaphroditus to get back in contact. If you go to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, the Bible talks about how the churches in Macedonia, including the church of Philippi, were extremely poor. So maybe their extreme poverty became so extreme that they could no longer support Paul in his ministry. For some reason, it wasn't because they lacked concern. It was because they lacked opportunity. For some reason, they had to halt their support for Paul. And Paul's thanking them, rejoicing in the Lord that they were once again able to revive that concern. But as we continue to verse 11, Paul doesn't want them to have any misconceptions. He doesn't want them to have any wrong assumptions about what he's trying to say. So look at verse 11. He says, not that I'm speaking of being in need. Why? For I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. Paul doesn't want the church of Philippi to get any wrong ideas about this. For Paul, it's not as much about the gift, it's about the relationship. For Paul, it's not so much about the money or the gifts or the food that the church of Philippi was sending. It was about the love, the care, and concern that demonstrated. And think about it. Whenever a little kid colors you a coloring page and they give it to you, maybe they wrote their name on it, maybe they colored a little bit outside the lines. But when you get that, why is that so special to you? Is it because you need it to survive? Is it because it's going to meet some kind of physical need? Well, no, it's because of the care, the love, and the concern that it demonstrates. And so I think we find the same thing here in Philippians chapter 4, that Paul's writing to them thankful for not just the gift, but for the friendship and the relationship, the love and the concern that gift demonstrates. He says, I'm thankful for what you sent me in verse 10. But then when you look at verse 11, Paul says, I didn't really need it. I'm thankful for the support, but it wasn't necessary. It wasn't a necessity. Well, Paul, what do you mean? You're sitting in house arrest. Don't you think that he could take everything that he could want? I mean, don't you think he had some needs that needed to be fulfilled? What do you mean you're thankful for this, but you don't really need it? Paul says, let me explain it to you. He says, I'm thankful for this gift, not because I have everything I need, not because of any outward circumstance or outward situation. He says, I want you to know I'm thankful for this gift, but I don't really need it because it's something I've learned inwardly. He says, I've learned a lesson by experience, by the life that I've lived. What did he learn? What's the title for our lesson tonight? I've learned to be content in every circumstance. He really reflects the same attitude that he had later in his life. In 1 Timothy, the 6th chapter, beginning in verse 6, he says, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can't take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing with these, we will be content. He's writing to say thank you. Thank you for not just the gift, but for the friendship and the relationship. And when it comes to the gift, I don't really need it, Paul says. Because of something I've learned. I've learned in whatever situation I'm in to be content. Look at how he elaborates on that in verse 12. He says, I know how to be brought low and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. Paul's been on both sides of the track. He's experienced both extremes. He knows what it's like to have everything he could ever want. But he also knows what it's like to be lacking what he needs on a daily basis. Paul knows what it's like to be so full that he couldn't eat another bite. And he also knows what it's like to be so hungry that his stomach is growling and hurting because he hadn't eaten anything for days. Because he just didn't have it. He says, I know what it's like to have abundance. I know what it's like to be in need. He says, regardless of the circumstances, I know the two extremes, and I've experienced everything in the middle. Paul says, none of that matters to me. He says, it's not about my circumstances, but again, go back to verse 11. It's about what I've learned. I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. He says in verse 12, I've learned the secret of facing all these things. Whether I'm hungry or full, whether I have abundance or whether I'm in need, whether I have everything I could ever wish for or I'm lacking daily necessities, Paul says, I've learned the secret of facing all of that and being content. Secrets, you usually want them to remain hidden, don't you? Have you ever told somebody a secret to find out that they went and told somebody else about it? That you wanted them to keep it a secret, but they ended up spreading that secret? It kind of reminds me of three men who went fishing one day. To pass the time while they were fishing, one of the men said, let's confess to each other our secret sins. So the first man said, I've been having an affair recently. The second man said, every single Friday night I go to the bar and I get drunk. The third man, with a little smile on his face, said, you guys might not want to hear this, but I'm the worst gossip in town. Their secrets didn't really remain a secret. And that's usually what we want with secrets. We want secrets to remain hidden. When you tell somebody a secret, you don't want them to turn around and tell somebody else. Well, Paul says, look, I've learned a secret. Whether I'm hungry or full, whether I have abundance or whether I'm in need. He says, I've learned the secret to being content regardless of my circumstances. Well, Paul, what is that secret? It's not something that he wants to remain hidden, because he tells us the secret in the very next verse. In verse 13. If we stop right here, you might be thinking, Paul, how in the world did you do this? How in the world were you content regardless of your circumstance? Like, I could get how you were content and satisfied. I can get how you were sufficient in life when you had everything. But how in the world were you content when you had nothing? When you were hungry? When you were in need? What's the secret to being content in every circumstance? And Paul says, let me tell you what it is. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13. I can do all things through Him, through Christ, who strengthens me. That's a pretty popular verse, isn't it? It's a verse that we see a lot. Perhaps one of the most famous verses in all of the Bible. Not just this letter, but the entire book. If you've heard anything about the Bible, you've probably heard or seen Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You see it online. You see it on social media. Preachers quote it all the time. We quote it all the time in various kinds of circumstances. When you see Philippians 4:13, very rarely is it attached to its context. Very rarely is it attached to what's going on in verses 10 and 11 and 12. Let me give you an example of that. Growing up, I really loved to play all kinds of different sports. I don't know why I picked football. I only played one practice of football. I was a 5th grader, got knocked out by an 8th grader. I was done with that. But can you picture a football team quoting Philippians 4:13 before a game? Well, we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. We're about to go out here and crack some heads. We're going to destroy the other team. Why? Because Jesus is the one who is strengthening us. That's the way that we oftentimes use that verse. Whether it's doing the impossible, whether it's overcoming some task that it seems like we're not going to be able to overcome, winning a sporting event, whatever it is. We use this verse in all kinds of different situations. Do you think that's how Paul is using this? You think that's what Paul means in Philippians 4:13? That you can go out and win the football game because Christ is the one who's strengthening you? Well, if it doesn't mean that, what does it mean? Go back to the context. What are we talking about? Paul says, regardless of my circumstances, I've learned to be content. I've learned the secret to facing both plenty and hunger and being satisfied. Now, of course, Paul doesn't want to be hungry. He doesn't want to be in need, but he says, if I find myself in that situation, I've learned the secret to being sufficient, being content, being satisfied. Okay, Paul, tell us that secret. Here's the secret. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. How can I live a life of contentment? What's the secret to that? How can I live a life where, regardless of what my life looks like, regardless of the people in my life, I can be content, not looking to the future, but content with this moment, right now in the present? How can I do that? Paul says Jesus is the secret. The secret to being content in every circumstance is what Paul wants every Christian to know. It's learning to rely and to depend on Jesus and the strength that He gives. We become independent of our circumstances when we're completely dependent on Jesus. At least that's what the Hebrew writer says. In Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6, he says, keep your life free from the love of money and what? Be content. Be satisfied. Be sufficient with what you have. Well, how can I do that? I'm looking towards the future and I want more things. I want better things. How can I be content with what I have right now? Here's how you can do it. For He has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. So that we may confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Once again, there's the secret. How can I be content with the things that I have? Look at what Jesus has promised. I'm never going to leave you. I'm never going to forsake you. And when we realize that, we live in confidence. We're able to confidently say, the Lord is my helper. Jesus is the one who's going to strengthen me and help me. And I'm not going to be afraid. What can a mere person, what can a mere man do to me when Jesus is the one who is strengthening me? It's the same message that we find here in Philippians 4. You want to live a life of contentment? You want to be content with whatever you have, whatever the circumstances might be? Learn to rely and to depend on Jesus. The strength that He gives. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. As Christians, we become independent of our circumstances when we are utterly and completely dependent on Christ. So don't talk tonight about your circumstances. Don't talk tonight about what you have or what you don't have. Don't talk tonight about your plans for the future. Talk tonight about your contentment in the present. How content are you with your life right now? With what you have right now? You might have that desire for more, that desire to be better, but are you allowing that desire to rob you of contentment with life right now? Really, what those questions funnel into is how much are you depending on Jesus? What kind of strength are you drawing from Him? How much time do you think about Him throughout the week? How much time do you talk to Him throughout the week? How much time do you allow Him to talk to you throughout the week? Because the secret to contentment is not a 5-step plan. The secret to contentment is not just changing the way that you think. The secret to contentment is not getting more things and then I'll be content. The secret to contentment is learning to depend on Christ and the strength that He provides. We can learn to be content in every circumstance because we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Is Jesus the one who's strengthening you tonight? Do you need to make a decision to draw closer to Him? If you do, then why not do that as we stand and as we sing?